Imagine living in a world where learning to heal could cost you your life. The candle burns low tonight, its flame trembling like a frightened soul. The wax drips slowly down the rough wooden table, pooling in soft white rivers. Outside, the wind moans through the cracks in the shutters, carrying with it the cold breath of a winter night. I draw my shawl tighter, though it does little to keep the chill away. It is not the cold that truly unsettles me, but the silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. In this silence, I remember. There was a time when the village came to me with simple troubles, a fevered child, a wound that would not heal, a mother frightened by a difficult birth. I learned the ways of herbs from my mother, who learned from hers, simple things like how to boil nettle leaves for pain, how to crush comfrey for broken bones. We called it wisdom, though others called it something darker. The church called it pride. Men called it dangerous. And when the wind turned bitter and the crops failed, when sickness spread faster than prayer, they called it witchcraft. You see, a woman who knows too much does not belong in peace. I often think of the night it began, the whisper that turned to suspicion, suspicion to fear, and fear to something crueler. I can still see the candlelight flicker across the faces of those who once trusted me. Their eyes did not hold gratitude anymore, they held questions, sharp and trembling. How did she know? They whispered. How does she heal what even the priest cannot? Knowledge, I learned, is a flame too bright for some to bear. There was no malice in my hands, only memory and care. Yet in a world built on obedience, curiosity was rebellion. A woman who read, who observed, who understood the patterns of the earth, she became a threat simply by existing. I did not seek power, only understanding. But even that, in these times, is enough to draw the noose. Tonight, as I sit by the dying candle, I can almost hear the echo of their footsteps, the ones who came with torches and trembling faith. They feared me, and I pitied them, for they had been taught to fear what they could not control. And perhaps, in their way, they were victims too. I close my eyes and breathe in the faint scent of sage and smoke. The herbs hang drying above the hearth, though no one dares come here anymore. The world outside still hungers for simple answers to its pain, but it has learned only to destroy those who hold them. If you listen closely, you might still hear voices like mine, soft and patient, speaking from the edges of history. We were the watchers, the healers, the quiet hands that soothed the sick while others prayed for miracles. If stories like this stir your curiosity about forgotten lives, remember to follow along and share what moment in history you'd never want to live through. But what frightened them more than the plague, was a woman who could think. They would never admit it aloud, of course. Their fear was dressed in piety, wrapped neatly in the language of salvation. The church spoke of order and divine will, of men appointed to guide and women chosen to serve. It sounded holy when spoken from the pulpit, yet beneath the hymns and incense, it was fear that ruled, fear of anything that could not be measured, contained, or blessed in Latin. I learned that fear wears many faces. Sometimes it comes in the trembling voice of a priest warning that Eve's curiosity cursed mankind. Other times, it comes as a husband telling his wife that the world is safer when she doesn't ask too many questions. And sometimes, it is a neighbor, clutching her rosary tighter when she sees you gathering herbs by the river. Knowledge, in my time, was not shared equally. Men wrote books, copied manuscripts, taught in monasteries. Women, if they learned at all, learned in whispers. We carried our wisdom in stories told by the fire, lessons about which roots soothed a fever, which teas calmed a restless child, which words could ease the dying. It was a quieter, older kind of knowing. And that quietness frightened those who believed that all truth should pass through the hands of the church. I remember the day Father Bernard came to my home. He stood by the hearth where the herbs hung drying and frowned as though the scent itself offended him. "The Lord alone heals," he said, his eyes moving from the bundles of rosemary to the small book I kept hidden beneath a cloth. "When you meddle in his work, you invite the devil to guide your hand. He burned them, every herb, every dried flower. The smoke filled my lungs, bitter and sweet. I said nothing. There was nothing I could say that would not sound like defiance. I only watched as years of quiet study turned to ash. He was not a cruel man, at least not in his own mind. He believed he was saving me. Saving the village. Saving the world from corruption. And that, perhaps, is what makes it all so tragic. Most of the punishers never thought themselves wicked. They were simply afraid. The fear of women's knowledge grew like a shadow across Europe. In Germany, in France, in England, women who brewed herbs for healing or helped deliver children began to vanish. Some were dragged to court, others were drowned in rivers or burned before crowds. The earliest whispers of witch trials were not yet the grand spectacles of later centuries, but the roots were there, in gossip, in jealousy, in the hunger to find someone to blame when prayers went unanswered. There was a midwife once, in the next village over. Her name was Alice. She had hands steady enough to bring life into the world when others had given up. But when a noblewoman's child was stillborn, they said Alice had cursed the birth. She was taken from her home in the middle of the night. I remember the next morning, the emptiness of her cottage. Her tools were scattered, her bed overturned, the air heavy with the scent of crushed time and fear. The church recorded her as a servant of darkness. The women of the village remembered her as someone who once stayed awake through the night, whispering comfort to the dying. Both, in their way, were true. In those years, the boundaries of acceptable knowledge were drawn in ink and fire. Men debated theology in halls of stone while women hid their learning in silence. To write, to question, even to remember too clearly, these could be dangerous acts. So we became archivists of the unspoken, keepers of invisible histories that could not be written down. And yet, even in that darkness, some of us continued. In secret gatherings, we traded seeds, recipes, and quiet prayers that did not sound quite like the ones from the church. We found ways to pass knowledge through gestures, a certain way of stirring a pot, a phrase slipped into conversation, a flower left at a doorstep. These small rebellions were our survival. Centuries later, they would call it superstition. But to us, it was love, the only kind we could offer in a world that punished compassion when it did not wear a priest's robe. Would you have dared to share what you knew, or would you have stayed silent to survive? Tell me in the comments. The mornings always began before the sun. The hearth was never truly cold, only sleeping beneath a thin veil of ash. I would stir it to life again, coaxing the fire to breathe. The scent of smoke mingled with lavender and thyme that hung from the rafters, the fragrance of both comfort and caution. Outside, the frost clung to the earth, pale and brittle as bone. It was a quiet world, one held together by habit and hope. My hands moved without thinking, measuring, grinding, mixing. Each motion carried the memory of those who came before me. The mortar and pestle had belonged to my grandmother. Its stone was smooth where generations of palms had pressed, as if the very act of healing had worn it gentle. I would crush dried willow bark for pain, steep chamomile to calm an uneasy heart. The knowledge came naturally, like remembering a song I had always known. The village women would come softly, their footsteps hushed, their cloaks drawn close. They came not because they trusted me fully, but because they had nowhere else to go. There were no physicians for people like us, only priests and prayers, and sometimes, if one was lucky, a woman who listened. I would tend to their wounds, soothe their fevers, help ease their labors. And for a little while, they would forget to be afraid of me. But fear always returned, carried on the toll of the church bell. It reminded them of what the priest had said, that knowledge was temptation, that women's words carried danger. So even as they whispered gratitude, they crossed themselves when they left. And I would smile, pretending not to notice. At dusk, when the village quieted and the smoke from the chimneys rose like ghosts, I would walk to the edge of the fields. The air smelled of damp soil and fading light. There, I gathered nettles and yarrow, roots hidden deep beneath the frost. I learned long ago that every plant held two faces, one that healed, and one that harmed. Much like us. Sometimes, I caught children watching from the hedges. Their eyes were wide, curious. I wanted to tell them that what I did was not witchcraft, only care, but words like that could echo too far. So instead, I would hand them a sprig of rosemary and tell them it was for memory. They would run home clutching it like a treasure, not knowing they carried danger in their little hands. Each secret I kept was another breath of safety, another heartbeat borrowed from fear. Rumors spread easily in small places. A mother's safe delivery could become a miracle. A failed healing could become a curse. If a cow sickened, if milk spoiled, if rain came too late, it took only a whisper for blame to find its way to my door. I learned to smile through suspicion, to speak softly and bow my head. Knowledge, I discovered, could not only heal, it could also isolate. There were nights when I questioned whether I was right to continue. When a child's fever broke after a night of prayer and herbs, I wondered if it was God's mercy or my grandmother's recipes that saved them. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. In this world, even gratitude was dangerous. When childbirth came, it was different. There was no room for fear then, only urgency, sweat, and the raw strength of women. I had seen death too often to flinch. I knew the signs, the paling lips, the slowing breath, the prayers whispered too late. And yet, I also knew the triumph, the first cry of a newborn, the trembling relief in a mother's eyes. Those were the moments that made the danger worth it. We midwives shared what knowledge we could. Sometimes we met under the guise of washing linens or visiting kin, our conversations stitched together between lines of small talk. For bleeding, try shepherd's purse, one would murmur. For sorrow, St. John's wort. These exchanges were our survival, our rebellion, our quiet defiance against ignorance. I often wonder how many of us were lost not to disease, but to the loneliness of knowing too much. We carried the weight of both gratitude and suspicion, of lives saved and lives accused. To heal was to walk a knife's edge between reverence and ruin. When the night came, and the village slept, I would sit by the dim light of my candle and write in secret. Not prayers, but recipes. Not spells, but knowledge. I knew that one day, someone might find my little book and burn it, just as the priest had burned my herbs. Still, I wrote. Because silence, too, is a kind of death. Outside, the owls called from the forest. The stars glimmered faintly beyond the smoke from my chimney. I thought of all the women like me, scattered across the countryside, tending fires, guarding secrets, loving the world enough to heal it even when it hated them for it. If you're still listening, take a moment to breathe, imagine the quiet courage it took just to keep others alive. They said she flew with demons, but I only saw her carry the dying child to safety. Her name was Alice, the midwife from the next village, the one whose hands could coax a life into the world when hope had already left the room. I still remember the night they came for her. The air was thick with mist, and the bells tolled far past midnight. Torches flickered through the fog, voices rough and trembling. They dragged her from her home while the ashes of her hearth still glowed. She didn't fight, only looked back once, as if she could still hear the faint cry of the infant she had saved the week before. By dawn, they had taken her to the church. I stood among the crowd, my shawl pulled low, my heart pounding with a fear I dared not show. They called her a witch, a servant of the devil. They said her herbs came from dark bargains, her knowledge from whispered spells. But those of us who knew her remembered something else, the way she hummed softly to frighten mothers, the way her fingers trembled when a child didn't breathe. Fear had become its own religion. The trials spread like a sickness. From village to village, whispers turned to accusations, and accusations to fire. Sometimes the victims were healers. Sometimes they were simply inconvenient women, widows, midwives, scholars, those who lived alone and dared to think. A misplaced word, a bitter neighbor, a jealous husband, all it took was one spark. The church wrote of saving souls, of purging evil from the land. But beneath the sermons and rituals lay something simpler, colder: control. Knowledge, especially in the hands of women, threatened the delicate order of a world ruled by men and mystery. If women could heal without priests, teach without permission, or question without fear, what then would become of authority? Alice never confessed. They said she screamed, but never begged. Some whispered she cursed them, others that she prayed until her voice gave out. I don't know which to believe. I only know that by the next morning, the smell of smoke lingered in the air for days, clinging to everything it touched. After that, silence settled over us all. No one spoke of her, not even the ones who had once come to her for help. We pretended not to remember. That was how we survived, by forgetting. I stopped hanging herbs in plain sight. I stopped offering advice unless asked. I stopped looking too long at the stars, for even wonder could be mistaken for witchcraft. But silence carries its own kind of pain. It seeps into the bones, into the stories that should have been told. The books we did not write, the songs we never sang, they all became ghosts, haunting the edges of history. Years later, when the fires dimmed and reason began to creep cautiously back into the world, their names were already lost. The women who had known the ways of earth and healing were gone, their wisdom scattered to the wind. What survived were fragments, recipes hidden in cookbooks, remedies disguised as household charms, prayers that were once instructions for medicine. The world forgot their faces but kept their knowledge, as if even fear could not erase their legacy entirely. Sometimes I wonder if Alice knew that. If, in those final moments, she understood that her life was part of something larger, a lesson written not in ink, but in ash and memory. Perhaps that's the cruel mercy of history. We burn, but our stories smolder on, glowing quietly beneath the dust. If her story moved you, share this moment with someone who loves history told softly and truthfully. The night is quiet now. The candle has burned to its end, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and wax. My story, like so many others, fades into the hush of centuries, but the echoes remain. You can find them in the soft hands of every nurse who stays beside a bed long after midnight, in the voices of teachers who pass down truths once forbidden, in the quiet persistence of women who still ask questions the world isn't ready to answer. Sometimes I wonder if much has changed. The punishments are not always fire and rope anymore, but they still exist: disbelief, dismissal, mockery. Even now, a woman who knows too much, or speaks too clearly, can find herself branded difficult, dangerous, or ungrateful. Perhaps the tools have changed, but the fear is the same, the unease that knowledge can belong to anyone, that wisdom does not ask permission. Yet, I take comfort in knowing that what was once whispered in secret is now spoken aloud. The knowledge they tried to silence has rooted itself deep into the world, into medicine, art, and understanding. Their legacy lives in every act of care, every question asked with courage, every truth carried forward. So, if you ever find yourself wondering whether a single voice can matter, remember ours. We were not saints or sorceresses, only women who refuse to stop learning, even when the world told us to be silent. If you're still awake, thank you for listening. Let's remember the women who whispered knowledge into the dark, and paid the price for our light.